You're listening to the Joy of Champagne podcast, your guide to the world of sparkling wines. And now your host, Deniz Bayram.
Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Joy of Champagne. I'm your host, Deniz Bayram. I'm a certified specialist of wine and a trained chef. Now, as a devoted wine lover, my goal is to spread my contagious passion and love for fine wine. This is our third episode of the Champagne 101 series and the part 2 of how is champagne made. Last episode, we started tackling the very complex matter of the methods of sparkling wine production. And this episode, we're continuing this theme by switching to the latter processes of how sparkling wine production finishes off and progresses through the aging period as well. Last episode, we talked about the difference between how champagne is made and Charmat method sparkling wines like Prosecco and Sect are made. And in this episode, we will focus on how differently they are aged as well. Because while some sparkling wines are aged for an extensive period of time, some are not. And this also obviously reflects on the price we pay for these sparkling wines. First of all, let's start talking about champagne. Champagne is indeed one of the most complex sparkling wines, as we've discussed how it is made last week. And I did try to keep it as simple as possible while I was talking about it last episode, because it is actually even more complex when you get down to it. And I think the aging process of champagne is even more complex and I think even more fascinating. So let's get back to our bottle of champagne, the champagne that has been bottled right after the addition of the mixture of yeast and sugar, and while the second fermentation is taking place in this closed bottle of champagne, we can start talking about how it will age after this point. So as our champagne goes through its second fermentation in the bottle, the yeast starts to consume the sugar and creates a CO2. But as the yeast does that through time, it also starts dying in a very, very slow pace. So as the yeast works, it gets tired and it starts dying. And the champagne nears to completion as it becomes drier and even more bubbly. Once the champagne is all the way through its second fermentation, the bottle is still sealed. There is CO2, there's additional alcohol now inside the bottle. But what happened to yeast? Did it just convert to alcohol and CO2 and just disappeared? Because it is a living being. Well, unfortunately, the yeast also stays behind inside the bottle. And that is very, very visibly clear once you actually see a bottle of champagne that has just finished its second fermentation. And what we call this dead yeast inside the bottle is called the lees, which is basically a name that's given to the sediment of dead yeast cells trapped inside the bottle. They are very visible when you put a bottle over a light, and you will see the dead yeast cells on the bottom of the bottle in a sandy, dusty, light brown color. But of course, whenever we get a bottle of champagne and drink it, we never come across to this dead yeast cell. So how does this disgusting sounding dead yeast cells are removed from the bottle of champagne before we get it in its most clear and clean form? Well, that's when the real story of champagne actually begins. And you will be surprised how much that dead yeast cells that looks slightly disgusting can add to the flavor of champagne. So what the champagne makers do after they are ended up with this dead yeast cells inside their finished bottle of champagnes is that they wait for this dead yeast cells to basically deteriorate. And this is the biggest part of the aging process of champagne, the deterioration of the lees, the yeast cells. Though it might sound anything but sexy, it is the process that actually gives the most beautiful and the most sought after flavors, unique flavors of champagne to the wine. And this aging, this deteriorating aging can take place from 3 months to 4 years to even decades. And this certainly differs from certain types of champagne to champagne, and also the price leagues of champagne as well. And do not forget, the champagne method of making sparkling wine isn't only valid for champagne, but in terms of champagne, the minimum legal amount for aging a bottle of champagne before release is 18 months. So regarding champagne, the wine would have to spend at least 18 months aging on its lees. But again, how are these lees removed from the bottles before they are released onto the market? Well, that's another very interesting and a fascinating process called disgorgement, the disgorgement of a bottle of champagne. So after the on the lees aging is done for at least 18 months for champagne, but it can be less for other traditional method sparkling wines like Cava or Franciacorta from Italy. But whenever the aging is done, in order to get the dead yeast cells out of the bottle, the disgorgement process basically slowly transfers the sediment of dead yeast cells, the lees, slowly into the top of the bottle, the mouth of the bottle, because while they're aging, the bottles are laying on their sides, and for this reason, the dead yeast cells are sitting on the bottom of the bottle on its side. In order to get them to the mouth of the bottle, because that is the only way out for anything that's inside the bottles are, over a long period of time, very slowly and gradually are twisted and in an angle are pointed downwards and being twisted at the same time in order to move that sediment slowly by slowly to the mouth of the bottle. And this twisting motion is called riddling in champagne. During this riddling process, and after it, once the dead lees are on the mouth of the bottle, literally hitting the cork or the cap that's closing off the mouth of the bottle, they are still in their loose form. So they're actually very, very volatile. If as soon as you shake or move the bottle, even in the slightest way, they would start mixing back into the wine again. So very gently, in order to get them out of the bottle, they need to be solidified so that they wouldn't have the chance to mix back into the wine again. In order to solidify them, there's only one way to do that. So what is done in champagne method is that once they're hitting the cork on the very mouth of the bottle, the mouths of the bottle are frozen as they are dipped into ice cold water. And only the very end of the bottle where the lees are collected are frozen, so that they would be the only ones that are solidified inside the bottle, so that they can leave the bottle in one solid form. After this freezing process, the real disgorgement process or the move takes place. So after the cap and the dead lees are frozen, the caps of the champagne bottles, the closures that are often in the form of a crown cap closure, which is the exact same kind of closure that we use in beer bottles, believe it or not, are also used for champagne. Each bottle is opened rapidly, so the dead yeasts are shot right off from the bottle within the pressure of the champagne, which leaves the bottle of champagne clear from any dead yeast cells, lees, or any other sediments. So that's how we end up with crystal clear champagne without any signs of sediment or dead yeast cells, thankfully. It is a quite entertaining process, and I would suggest everyone who's listening to this podcast to go to YouTube and type in disgorgement or disgorgement of champagne and actually watch how this process is being made. It's fascinating to watch it, how the end of the bottle is being frozen and how the dead lees are being shot as they're disgorged and opened rapidly one by one. And as one would expect during this process, a very tiny amount of champagne is lost because whenever you open a bottle of champagne, you are bound to lose some amount. But this doesn't really pose a big problem because the amount that's been lost or during the disgorgement process is topped off after with wine that is sourced from other bottles of champagne, although it would be the same wine, obviously. After that, simply the bottle of champagne is closed off by a cork, and a classical sparkling wine cage, which stops the cork from spontaneously shooting off, is placed on top of the cork. It is the metal part where we start twisting first of all when we start opening a champagne. Then a bottle of champagne is finally completed to be sold off and released to the market. What about other sparkling wines like Prosecco, which are produced in the Charmat method? How are they aged after the second fermentation process takes place and finishes? Actually, it's again almost the same process as champagne, but since the Charmat method takes place in a tank, the aging also does take place in a tank. So once the second fermentation is done in the closed tank, and then the resulting dead yeast cells that are the byproducts of the second fermentation stay in the tank, they stay within the tank for a period of time to give off flavor to the wine. Though you can probably imagine that a lees aging inside a big tank in Prosecco is not the same as lees aging within individual bottles of champagne. The second fermentation that takes place inside a tank, as opposed to the second fermentation that takes place inside of a champagne bottle, is much less stronger in terms of the pressure of the carbon dioxide gas, and as well as the leftover lees that are in contact with the wine, because those two will be the key factors that eventually determine the quality of the wines. When the second fermentation takes place inside a big tank, a big closed tank, compared to a thick champagne bottle, the fermentation and its byproducts of carbon dioxide and as well as yeast are not as intense as they would be in a bottle of champagne. The reason for this is because the fermentation takes place in a much bigger, larger vats compared to a small bottle. And for this reason, there is much less carbon dioxide that's been produced, and a less amount of lees are in the end produced on the bottom of the vat. And these two account for the quality of the sparkling wine because they add the gas and they add the flavor into our wines. And if the fermentation gases are not as strong, then we won't be having a bubbly wine as strong as champagne. And also, we won't be having a wine that is as intensely flavored as champagne as well. This is the case for Prosecco. In Prosecco, the bubbles will be larger and lesser as opposed to champagne, which you will notice that there are many bubbles, but those bubbles are very small and very fine, and they flow in a continuous stream in a very uniform manner. In Prosecco, when you pour a glass of Prosecco, you will see that the bubbles will be pretty much all over the place, and the size of the bubbles will vary, but they will be always larger, slightly larger than the champagne bubbles. And in terms of the flavors and the aromas, you won't be smelling a lot of nutty, a lot of bready, biscuity notes in Prosecco as you would in champagne, though in Prosecco you will get a much more fresh, fruit-forward, juicy aromas that are actually coming from the grape. In champagne, those secondary, biscuity, bready, beautiful aromas come with the extended lees aging that happens over months and in some quality champagnes over years. So I hope you now have a better understanding of how different types of sparkling wines are made and the quality differences between them. We talked about two different main methods of making sparkling wines, and these were the champagne method, as known as traditional method, and the Charmat method, which is widely used for the popular sparkling wine Prosecco. In our next episode, we'll be talking about sugar and sweetness in sparkling wines and how they affect the quality and the taste of the sparkling wines, but also the price we pay for them, and if that makes any difference according to the sweetness of the wine. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay bubbly.
Before we end, a word from our sponsors. This episode of the Joy of Champagne podcast was brought to you by
The Excelsior by Dukes, one of the world's finest champagne flutes. 10.7 inches tall with a 10-ounce capacity. Handcrafted and mouth-blown, lead-free crystal glass. Find out more at clubdukes.co. That's spelled clubdux.co. Because there are some things man can make better than any machine.
Thanks for listening to the Joy of Champagne podcast, your guide to the world of sparkling wines. We hope you join us on the next episode. In the meantime, feel free to visit us at joyofchampagne.com or drop us an email at hello@joyofchampagne.com.